The Old Woman Who Lived with a Bear. The traditional descent of the mountain Goths, or for that matter the lowland, of the Triune Monarchy, may be open to question. What is not open to question is that the mountain, if not the lowland Goths, believe this tradition implicitly. This makes them very, very indulgent to the handful of Italians, makers and vendors of ice cream chiefly in the market towns, who have trickled into and taken up residence in the Gothic Alps. However, this indulgence is always hedged about with qualifications.
"You mind you give us full measure of that there sweet snow?"
they sometimes warn Luigi or Giovan,
"else we'll go and capture that there Rome of yours again."
Their lowland kinfolk have long ago become accustomed to the probability that their forefathers, having migrated in the early Middle Ages from the Goutlands of South Scandia, and hence their forefathers never even smelled Rome, burning or otherwise. As long as the price of butter, eggs, and milk, the three pillars of the Gothic lowland economy, hold up, the lowland Goths will listen calmly to any historical account, even if it has them descended from giraffes. The rich bosom of the Gothic lowlands, upon which the imperial city of Bela floats, or perhaps it doesn't float, rests then, like a jewel, this is the central fact of the Triune Monarchy. The mountains of the Gothic hegemony are something else, of course. Eszterhazy had dedicated the first week in May to botanizing in the hills behind Grach. Not that he could not have botanized elsewhere just as well, but his Aunt Emma wished it. Even the Dr. Eszterhazys of this world have Aunt Emmas, and when Aunt Emma takes a notion to be insistent, even unreasonably so, the nephew is likely to do nothing more than sigh and say, "Very well, Aunt Emma," even as you and I.
"Engelbert, you always go in May, I know, to recruit your health by picking flowers and such like near Grach." "By no means always near Grach, Aunt Emma. I did go to the Grachs once, to be sure, but I like to spend that week in a different place each year, if possible, in order to obtain wider samples of flora. So—"
He might just as well have said Mumblety Peg, Minnie and Meg, for the good it did. Lady Emma Eszterhazy said to her English maid,
"More tea for Dr. Engelbert, churchwarden, please."
And she said,
"As you know, your dear Uncle Ferdinando left all sorts of bits and pieces of estate here and there and everywhere. And thank you, churchwarden, I shall ring when we need you." "Has she quite gone, Engelbert? Engelbert, take a cheroot from the box there, one for yourself if you like, and of course one for me. You know that I dearly love a cheroot, but churchwarden, though she has been with me ever since before I met your Uncle Ferdinando, and was swept off my feet, and into Scythia, Pannonia, Transbalkania, has never learned to accept these continental customs, so she must never know. No. Now, Sgrax."
Sgrax was certainly one of the late Ferdinando Eszterhazy's bits and pieces of estates. He was the cadet of a cadet branch of a line of the family with a propensity for difficult inheritances. Consequently, it was not perhaps to be expected that the best part of the settlement should have gone to him. He left his English-born widow bits and pieces of estates, because bits and pieces were what he had inherited, and, as he was in no sense a canny hand at management, what he had to leave, viz., the same bits and pieces he had inherited, including Sgrax.
"Sgrax,"
said Lady Emma, cheerfully puffing her cheroot,
Sir Grax is the bane of my existence. The steward cheats me, I am sure he does. I want you to check up on him, Engelbert. I, of course, do not wish to interfere with your rambles and such, but it will be quite easy. I shall give you a note, and you'll be put up at Sir Grax, and you can ramble around there, and see how the steward cheats me.
Dr. Eszterhazy sighed, but it was an inward sigh. Outwardly he said, "Very well, Aunt Emma." And after some more discussion of details, Lady Emma rang, and Churchwarden came and removed the tea-tray and the ash-tray. Her coeval and mistress gave him a triumphal stare and hissed,
"See, she never knew a thing, never suspects."
Churchwarden, one supposed, simply supposed that Eszterhazy chose to smoke 2 cheroots simultaneously. The steward of Sir Grax clearly did not believe for one moment that Eszterhazy had come looking for stamens and rhizomes. After having seen the best room shaken down and Eszterhazy installed in it, he stood with both gaitered legs apart and hands behind his back, for all the world like a soldier who had received the command, "At ease," and said stiffly, "I suppose your Excellency will want to see the account-books."
"Nonsense, Chilperitz. Why should I want to see the account-books? And I repeat, I am not your Excellency. I am Dr. Eszterhazy."
He gazed around the room. Despite the walls bearing far too many evidences of former lords of the manor and their fondnesses for slaying the wild fauna of the area, it was rather a nice room. Frau Chilperitz had provided a choice sampling of the flora of the area, but she had put them all into vases of water. "And me, who has known you since you were Master Engelbert," the steward said dolefully. Eszterhazy sighed. "Oh, very well then, Chilperitz. Let me see the damned account-books. There, and I knew that the Sir Doctor would be wanting to see them, so here they are." And he set them down on the table. They were bound in leather, as they had been bound since time immemorial by the one book-binding establishment in Grach, and no doubt would be of some interest to students of mountain Gothic bookbinding. Eszterhazy gave them a stare apiece.
"There, now I've seen the damn things, so take them away," he said.
But they were not taken away. Eszterhazy, his kit full of specimens, had passed through the picturesque small town of Grach. That is, he had halfway passed through it, when he saw a lime tree spreading out its branches and giving such a tempting shade that he simply had to sit at the table beneath it. And since the table and its chairs were part of the teeny-tiny tavern set back a bit behind the tree, it seemed only courteous that he order something. He could not, however, make up his mind what to order, so the pleasant young woman ventured to make it up for him.
"I will bring my sir a glass of sorrel soup," she said.
The notion that he might like a glass of soup, any kind of soup, was remote from finding acceptance, but it would have been impolite to refuse. It did not look very nice. It looked rather nasty, being of a greenery, yellowy colour, and full of flocculences. It had a strange, astringent taste. It was not entirely unpleasant. It was perhaps an acquired taste, and before it was gone for more than a second or so, he discovered that he had in fact just now acquired a taste for it. He took his time over the second glass of the sorrel-grass soup. The afternoon had some time left to it. He would let the cool of the day catch up with him before getting up to finish his walk back to Sir Grax. There was no hurry. And there, back at Sir Grax, he would have a bath, and then a leisurely supper. And then, well, then he would arrange the results of the day's botanizing. and then he would retire early, adjust his travelling lamp — the lamps at Sir Grax had been formed to burn whale, or perhaps it was rapeseed oil, and tended to resist kerosene — and read another soothing chapter of With Clive in India, by that excellent English author, Mr. G. H. Henty. Then, amidst the sweet scents and soft noises of the mountain country, then he would turn out the lamp, turn over on his left side, and he must have fallen asleep right there, but there. And at first he thought that perhaps 20 years had passed, as in the quaint American tale of Rip Von Winkle, for he saw, standing solemnly before him, the same, surely the same, set of faces he had seen when, his Uncle Ferdinando being still alive, they had received the village council on some occasion or other. A loyal address to the throne was perhaps the subject, or perhaps a request for a rebate on the season's rents. But the dregs of the sorrel soup still stood in front of him, so 20 years had not passed after all. "Yes," he said, feeling slightly embarrassed. "Yes, Mayor Odopfacker, I greet you in the name of God." "And the holy company of the angels," replied old Odopfacker. "Tell us, high-born and august excellency, you being, as we hear, a master juris consult, is it lawful for an old woman to live with a bear?" Eszterhazy did not feel it appropriate at the moment to tell them that the title of Master Juris Consult had been obsolete since the Confederacy of the Middle Easter had gone down to defeat before the forces of Napoleon, nor did he allow his face to show either astonishment or mirth. He considered the question with furrowed brow for a moment. "Well, Master Mayor, this is no simple question which you raise. However, it is held ipso facto and ipse res in the Code of Justinian that a bear is a wild creature, just as a stag or an eagle is a wild creature, and that no one may hold a right of property vested in a wild creature, for the sufficient reason that a wild creature, being wild, is not subject to control. And what we cannot control, we cannot own. However, as the Pandects of Charlemagne tell us, abeunt studia in mores, which is to say, practices zealously pursued become habits, and also medio tutissimus ibis, with a middle course one goes most safely. The venerable heads before him nodded their assent. Since, therefore, the bear in question cannot belong to anyone, it cannot belong to anyone else either. And if the old woman in question is otherwise a civil and a law-abiding subject of his Imperial Majesty, whom God spare for many years, chorused the elders, one does not see that it can be unlawful for her to live with the bear in question, eh? There fell a silence, and then one of them, by his looks even more ancient than the mayor, declared, "Well, that be true. A bear do be a wild animal, and no denying of the factual." They bowed and expressed thanks, bowed again, and filed away. But it cannot be said that they looked in all manner satisfied, and Eszterhazy's conscience prickled him a little bit. But at the moment he could think of nothing to do about it, and perhaps, after all, he had done all that he or anyone else could do. So he paid his bill and went home by way of the chapel of St. Ulfilas, a move he soon had a mind to regret, for whom should he see in the outer garden, with his cassock tucked into his cincture, but Father Alarit, Chilperitz, parish priest, and one who dearly delighted in a good religious wrangle out of the pure and disinterested principle of Christian love. Thinking to avoid a frontal attack, Eszterhazy attempted a feint.
"Good evening, Father, and what can you tell me about the old woman who lives who lives with a bear?"
But the wily cleric popped up out of an earthwork, so to speak, and fired a bombard.
"Better ask what I can tell you about your own sins. When was the last time you made your Easter duty? Down there in Bella, and up to your neck, I have no doubt, with opera singers and Freemasons."
The fiery little priest began with relish.
"My dear Father, up here and out of touch with things, are you not aware that nowadays most opera singers are Freemasons?"
Exit Eszterhazy under cover of a sapping operation. That night at dinner all was very traditional. The steward standing at ease and supervising the gardener's boy, who acted as waiter. It was not that traditional that they washed the guests' feet, but both wore towels in their belts to show that they remembered, and on a stool in the corner the manorial zither player playing songs from the Gothic wars. And the steward, of course, tasting each dish first, and then they all waited for a full minute to see if he had been poisoned by, as it might have been, a Turkish spy. Frau Chilperitz at the door, and in a whisper,
"Sweet and sour hare."
Waiter-boy in a pubescent rottle,
"Sweet sour rebus."
Chilperitz, "A most excellent guest, a humble hare, sauced both sweet and sour." Takes a gobbet on a spoon, puts the spoon back in the tureen, chomps the gobbet. Old Emil in the corner.
"Oh, 24 red-haired maidens in the high tower,
Pringle, prangle.
Oh, Kunigunda, oh."
Pringle, prangle. Eszterhazy,
"Tell me, Chilperitz, as soon as you've got a mouth free, what is all this about an old woman who lives with a bear?"
A waiter-boy drops the tureen. Chilperitz, "The dish was not worthy of the most excellent, and as he has tasted it by proxy, no one else may taste of it." Eszterhazy,
"Quick thinking, Chilperitz, but if you drop dead in the course of the meal, I shall take a hasty emetic."
Frau Chilperitz,
"Roast capon with gooseberries."
a waiter-boy on his knees cleaning up the mess and dodging Chilperitz's boot. Chilperitz,
"A most excellent guest, a roast capon sauced with gooseberries."
Eszterhazy waits till the fowl is safely on the table.
About the old woman now."
Chilperitz,
"I have left the account books on the bedside table for the most excellent guest, if he pleases."
Old Emil,
"Oh, 24 Gothic knights to the high tower,
Pringle, prangle.
Oh, Kunigunda, oh."
Pringle, prangle. Finally it was time for his bedtime read. He picked up With Clive in India, and opened it to the bookmark with a subliminal feeling that the bookmark was the wrong colour and in the wrong place. Although the wools have not the fine texture of merino, the market at Kixpalax each year— Damn! What the hell was this? The wool market at Kixpalax had no business being in India, not even with the wildest notions of boundary revisions. He looked at the spine. The spine was faded. He tried for the title page, which resisted him, coyly interposing the piece of bound-in tissue paper, which was supposed to protect the half-colour plate. Ha! Of course, With Clive in India had no such frontispiece. 12 years in the Triune Monarchy, experiences of a consul's wife in the cities and villages and among the picturesque people of the valley of the Ister and the mountains of Scythia, Pannonia, Transbalkania. Here the book slipped. He clutched it, and it opened at the flyleaf.
To my dearest Emma Eszterhazy, compliments of the authoress, Sissy Potlatch Snurf.
He grunted and flipped to the title page once again. Potlatch Snurf was too good. Ah, yes, Cecily Piggott Smith. Husband used to be HBM consul at Avar Ister, and what was the book doing here? Well, for one thing, it was about the same size and colour of binding as Clive, and for another, Eszterhazy's manservant, Herrick the Mountain Sagani, who had packed the kit for the journey, could read and write no language but the Zekel runes. That he had happened to pack the wrong book, but one in the same language, was mildly curious, no more. Well, Mrs. Piggott Smith's comments on the wool market in and around Kix Pollack's were not really what he wanted right now. What else might there be? There might be, and in fact was, a small volume entitled A Nosegay of Nocturnal Devotions for the True Humble Soul, plus 10 Curses Against the Turks. And, what were these, looking faintly familiar? To 1 gallon turps at half a ducat per gallon. To 1 pair best bristle brushes at 1 ducat. What the devil? Cottage and buyer ye Wolfenspring. Rent at ducats 100 per annum. Tribute at eggs 6 score. Lambskins 1, 2 cockerel. Ah, it was those damnable account books. Had Aunt Emma really missed an egg? Still, how was it that Chilperitz, over 100 miles away in the Highlands, seemed to know very well that he was suspected of malfeasance at Lady Emma's down in Bella? Well, no great mystery. Doubtless some letters had been written. Pish, tush. Not yet time for sleep. Well, then, back to Mrs. Sissy and her 12 picturesque years. Sigh. The best place to begin in such a case was at the index. The index here was copious, beginning with Abernathy Dukov shoots grouse in Riphaean Alps, and concluding with Zimlak Piotro, patriot poet of Hyperborea, a sonnet by. Idly running his eyes back up the columns, Eszterhazy blinked and stared. Bears, allegedly eaten Little Byzantia. Bears, skins of, use of for shakos. Bears dancing, gypsies trained. Bears hunted, Pannonia. Bears Hyperborea. Bears hunted, Scythia. Bear Greece exported. Bear, old woman who lived with. Bears, myths and legends. Bear, cub, pet. Bear, bear, bear. Slowly the book slipped down. His head snapped back. Slowly Herrick rose from his usual sleeping place by the door, and on silent feet came and blew out the lamp. And this was rather odd, because Herrick had stayed behind, on orders, in Bella. Eszterhazy slept. When he looked, only half remembering for the book next morning, it was gone. The account books, though, were not. Odd. He had told Frau Chilperitz after dinner that he would be going up the mountain the following day, and she had packed him a lunch. "Only a small one now," he had warned, and she, oh, to be sure, she had understood perfectly, she said. And, of course, she had not. Not only did the basket contain more than he wished to eat, it contained more than he wished to carry. Frau Chilperitz had not understood the first, but she had anticipated the second, and so Eszterhazy, who had wanted to be by himself, learned that he was to be by himself, along with the company of the garden-boy come waiter who carried the basket. Feudal traditions worked more than one way, but of course he had known that for a long time. "How call they thee?" he asked the boy as they walked along an overgrown but fully serviceable path, the tinkle of goat bells in their ears.
"Cosmo, to serve God, the Emperor, and your Highness."
It interested Eszterhazy to be reminded that the old ways were best discerned among the very young, as well as the very old. The gardener, in whose company Cosmo passed most of his time, must have been close to 80, and no doubt it was the gardener who had taught the boy these antique expressions. Grach, looking more than ever as though to be made out of marzipan by some guild of fairy craftsmen, appeared briefly far below, then vanished as the path turned.
"Listen, Cosmo, I am not called His Highness. My grandfather was called His Highness. I am called Sir Doctor." "Oh," said the boy in naive surprise.
He was perhaps 13, perhaps 14, and had evidently recovered in full from the mishap of the previous night, for he smiled contentedly as he met Eszterhazy's eyes. He was what some boobling professor would doubtless describe as a pure Gothic type. That is, his hair had once been blonde, and would probably become brown, and was now brownish-blonde, and his eyes were blue, or anyway bluish, or one might say hazel, somewhat. His nose was freckled and tended toward the snub, as in both cases traditional in boys, but long before he was the age of the gardener, who was probably his great-uncle, it would be almost as hooked as the old man's was. And as for his complexion, why, one might call it fair, or sun-tanned, or olive. His cheekbones, he had cheekbones. The Scythian Goths, like any other wandering people, i.e., at one time or other every people, of the days of yore, had certainly not taken genealogical tables along with them, and equally certainly they certainly had taken along with them as many nubile women as they could possibly pick up along the way.
"Does the plant called blue friar grow in these parts?"
In between great rocks, detritus of ancient avalanches, the path wound.
"My granny would know."
"Ah,
"Pity then she's not here,"
Eszterhazy said indulgently.
"Ah, but she is, for there's Wolfensprings now."
The mountains had sagged here long, long ago, had subsided as though intending to make land level enough, if not very, very level, and land wide enough for a small peasant farmstead, one cottage, one byre and byre yard, a garden, small orchard, some pasture, and the spring itself purling prettily out of its conduit in the wall of the low byre. And one woman, one old woman, starting to throw out her arms at sight of the boy, stopping at sight of Eszterhazy, being very, very still for a moment, long enough for Cosmo to cry,
"Granny, I brought thee a doctor."
then again moving, doing traditional, "Oh, a stranger is coming" things. A handsome old woman.
"Well, Granny of Wolfensprings," Eszterhazy said, "I haven't brought my medical bag, but if I can hear I may be able to advise."
His medical bag was in Bella, and as to his advice, well, there was no false shyness.
"Ah, sir, when people grow to an age, their joints ache, as Dr. Engelbert must know."
He had no idea who she was, but word would have gotten around of his being here.
"Sometimes my wrists and hands, sometimes my knees, my ankles and feet."
He examined wrists and ankles. She was, of course, barefoot, probably carried her shoes as far as the church lane before putting them on Sundays. The knees he took on faith.
"An infusion of willow bark may be of help," he suggested. I'll give the apothecary a prescription, and Cosmo can bring up the medicine. Warm poultices with very warm water, as often as you have time."
Probably she did not have much time. The farm was small, but there was no sign of a farmer, no boots, no musket, no shirt being mended, no hunt cap.
Recollect to keep the joints warm come winter, come fall even. Is the house dry?"
She said the house was dry. She thanked him with dignity, and offered him simple hospitality, coffee, curds, a dish of preserves. He did not stay long. Something came to him as they were about to leave.
"Is the rent too much, or the tribute?"
A curious look she gave him, then shook her head.
"It is not too much. Pray, my duty and respects to Lady Emma."
It was not till later that the lad said, softly, regretfully,
"Ah, we did forget to ask about the Blue Friars plant."
A feeling, as of the rightness of the moment, stole over Eszterhazy.
"Tell me now, Cosmo," he said, "about the old woman who lived with a bear."
It had been a good lunch for Cosmo. He had eaten the black bread and cheese and sausage end which Frau Chilperitz had included for him. He had also eaten half of the sandwiches and almost all of the pastry which he had packed for the guest, and the better part of the fruit.
"Well, Sir Doctor, it is a very curious thing."
A sidelong glance.
"A very curious sort of thing. There was a man, Sir Doctor, who was an infidel, and there was a woman, Sir Doctor, as was a witch. Being an infidel, he didn't believe as she was a witch, you see. So what does she do? She charms him and turns him into a bear, and she makes him live with her, because that is his punishment for being such an infidel."
He re-examined the ruinations of the lunch, and turned a piece or two over again with a finger, but that was all he did. It had been a very good lunch for Cosmo.
I see. And the priest, can he do nothing?"
Very firmly Cosmo shook his head.
"Not without the bishop gives him leave, and the bishop, he lives in Dominetz, ever such a long ways off."
And that, as far as Cosmo was concerned, was clearly that. As for Dominetz, it was a full 25 miles away, and even before the new road had been put through a decade past, it would have been considered a scandal had not the bishop made the trip at least once a year to confirm the children. A piece of the story appeared to be missing. Well, perhaps it would fall into place some time, and if not, not. The apothecary did not so much attempt social equality, a matter to which Eszterhazy was indifferent, as scholastic co-eminence.
"Do you know whom they mean here when they say the doctor? Me? You? Never!"
He brought his round red face close.
"The barber, that's who, the barber! And in a way, why not, eh? Doctor, why not? Doesn't he draw blood every time he shaves, eh? Nay, but really, because he cups, he sets leeches, he lances boils, he makes liniments. Well, if that is progress, if that is science, then we may as well retire, you and I. I think it is retrograde. I think it should be illegal. And to that effect I have written our delegate, Dr. Duris Alperitz, the priest's cousin. And you know the nature of his reply?"
Again he leaned across the counter.
"His reply was to this effect, and concluding in these words: 'My colleagues and I intend to give your views the most intense reflection.'"
He gave an emphatic nod, and slapped his hand on the counter. and picking up the prescription once again, he once again read it aloud in round, rolling tones, giving each common abbreviation its full form, and lending to the recitation an air of one pronouncing a valedictory address, of course also in Latin, at a gymnasium graduation.
"You will know, then,"
Eszterhazy said, in a tone which took it for granted that the learned apothecary really would know, of course, and the learned apothecary, nodding rapidly at each word,
"this old woman who lives with a bear."
And, of course, he did know.
"Knew him, too," he said. "He was in the 5th Regiment, the famous 5th, you know. It was a piece of shell-fire that he took in the head during the Serbian War. Affected the brain, naturally. Ran off from the hospital, fetched him back, ran off again, fetched him back. We're going to court-martial him. Was found unfit to plead by reason of insanity. So they let him go. But they wouldn't give him any pension, of course. Can't reward desertion, can we?"
Skyrockets went off in Eszterhazy's head. The famous 5th Regiment of Hussars, of course. Eszterhazy had always considered that he had as good a command of the colloquial as anyone of his level, and far better than most. But that the word was, in this local, immediate sense, slang, no, this had never occurred to him. Many examples occurred to him now.
"Tilda thinks she's much, keeping company with a bear."
"Tried to get into the Bears, my sister's son. They turned him down for a lousy half-inch below the minimal height, so now he's mucking in the mucking muck with the mucking sappers instead."
Very faintly he smiled, remembering the boy Cosmo's account. Folk-tale had turned a common case of concubinage into something almost out of the Odyssey. Well, it wouldn't be the first time.
"Ah, by the way, Doctor,"
the apothecary said, suddenly confidential,
"I see that the filly's in town. Always looking for trouble. Don't know why the high-born lady hasn't turned him out long ago. Of course it is none of my... Many times I have thought that he and Steward Chilperitz, they would come to blows. Well..."
The apothecary seemed suddenly to think that he had said enough, if not too much, so he looked at the antique clock standing between two equally antique shelves of medicine jars, Tink Bell, Elix Opie, Thur Ven, and even Pulv Corn Uni.
"Time I was getting started on this prescription, Doctor. You may have confidence. Thank you, thank you."
Only about a third of Grack village formed part of the Scracks estate, and if one took care and remembered correctly, one might avoid the third which did. And if one didn't, well, how many suggestions about the rents could one listen to? How many fireplaces in need of repair, never mind what steward says, could one inspect? How many parlours, stifling with camphor and polish and never-opened windows, could one sit in and drink coffee? And how much coffee could one drink? Eszterhazy had been all through this before, on his last visit to Grack, which was one reason why he had not wanted to make this visit either. Nor had he calculated that he could not, in any case, keep away from the estate if the estate, or part of it, came looking for him, which it now did. He had met Filii 2 or 3 times that last time. He had no desire to take up an acquaintance which had never really existed, but he did recognize the man, who had not much changed. He was greyer of head, redder of face, and even more of a bullock as to body than before. More of a bullock as to mind one would not have thought it possible to be. He was also the largest tenant of the estate, and so, of course, paid the largest rent. Was the rent too large? Philly thought so. Who was there who paid rent who did not think so? The old woman at the Wolfenspring must have been one of the two. But times were not bad, times were not so hard, certainly not for a prosperous peasant. Farm produce held its own level, wheat did well. There was no sign that Philly was suffering hunger or thirst. How account for his rage? For the rage was there. It was plain from the first sight of the man. He was polite, but words seemed to choke him. It may not have been personal, but Eszterhazy felt the man's emotions like a blast of heat. The few phrases of civility aside, the man, in his good clothes and boots, facing Eszterhazy there on the shady street and grinding his teeth, said,
"It must come off. It can't go on. I can't pay it. Can't go on. Won't. Must tell her ladyship. Have written. Oh, good."
Then, as Eszterhazy said nothing, understanding almost nothing, the heavy face grew purple, the heavy mouth drew up under the heavier moustache, the bristly cheeks swelled. If he had raised one fist, Eszterhazy might have struck him, or likelier drawn back and warned him, but he raised both fists, his eyes rolled up, growls rattled in his thick throat.
"Philly, you will have an apoplexy if you go on like this. Be calm. Open your collar. Cool off for a moment."
But Philly was past hearkening. His shout was wordless. He beat his fists against his head. He stamped his boots upon the grassy roadside. It was almost a caricature of a man in a passion. But the man was in a passion.
"God in heaven!"
he cried, able to articulate again.
"Do they want to burn the eyes out of my head? I will not pay it more."
His stick, half staff, half cudgel, had fallen. He stooped and snatched it up and struck it against the tree they stood beneath. Again, again, again. The tree trembled. Showers of twigs and leaves fell. Surely the stick must break. But the sticks in the Gothic highlands are made of hard and tough wood. The stick did not break. Sweat poured down the man's face. He groaned aloud. Eszterhazy stretched out his right arm, stretched out his right hand, stretched out the index finger, and pointed it. It did catch Philly's eyes. The eyes followed the finger. The finger swung round. The insane attack upon the tree paused, the stick upraised to renew it. The index finger of the right hand swung round to the left pocket of Eszterhazy's coat. The hand delved in the pocket and came out with something between the index and middle fingers. A small notebook, red, bright red. The eyes of the rich tenant farmer followed it as the eyes of a bull are said to follow a red cape or other garment. Next a pencil appeared. Softly,
"You wish me to tell my lady aunt that you will no longer pay it? Very well. I promise nothing, but I shall write it down before your eyes. Philly says he will no longer pay the required rent."
The man swung his head up, away from the notebook. His eyes were full of blood.
"It is not the rent, man. It is the encumbrance."
Ah! Eszterhazy had not known that Philly's farm was encumbered, but there was no reason why he should have. However, he nodded, and he wrote it down. And Philly burst into tears. They were not tears of gratitude, nor were they tears of rage. The Scythian peasant does not shame to cry, even publicly. Such tears as these, though, one might see shed at the graveside of a wife or child. He had crossed his hands and bowed his head upon them, and he sobbed aloud, and he wept.
"Remember, nothing is promised, but I will look into it."
He heard the man behind sobbing for a long while. In the account books, the rent on Filii's farm stood at 1,000 ducats, and the tribute— Eszterhazy could not attempt to calculate what the monetary value of the tribute might be, and in any case it would vary, not only from year to year, but from season to season. Items on it must have come down unchanged since God knows when. Item 1 halberd leather, for instance. It was doubtful that either Filii or Chilperitz could have defined a halberd to save their own hides. As for so much hemp, so much flax pounded, so much flax unpounded, so many jars of goose grease, did they know of all this back down at the Royal and Imperial Institute of Agriculture Commerce in Bella? Never mind. It was not the goose grease, nor the down and feathers, nor any of that which was behind Filii's rage and torment. The encumbrance, he had said, and so here it was.
Alperit's stead,
and that was the farm's name,
is encumbered with a pension in amount of 150 ducats payable.
The handwriting of the steward was very pleasant to observe, but not always the easiest to read.
Payable to Elisafeta Henko at Wolfenspring on Old Christmas and on Ascension Day.
In effect, then, Filii was paying an extra rent, though, of course, the second one, the pension, bore no comparison to the first one, the rent proper. The situation was not unusual. Landowners had clear notions of noblesse oblige, and if someone on an estate required support, why, landlords would see that the support was forthcoming. However, as was only human nature, they did not care to have their own direct incomes diminished by such support. Chilperitz, for example, if Chilperitz were obliged to retire suddenly by reason of, say, illness or accident, not directly connected with his work as steward, why, Chilperitz would still certainly be pensioned. But Lady Emma's attorney would certainly not advise her to pay the pension herself. The amount of the pension would be levied in the form of an encumbrance upon some other farm which formed part of the estate in the Grax area. This was the way it was done.
"Cosmo," he asked, "what does it mean to burn the eyes out of someone's head?"
A sort of sadly knowing smile came over the boy's pleasant face.
"Well, Sir Doctor, suppose now 2 fellows are wanting to walk out with the same girl, and one of them gets to walk out with the girl, and he swanks it over the other. Ja, it's me as is walking out with Kunigunde. And then, by and by, the other fellow, he takes her away from him, see? And so what do he do every time they walk out together? Why, he makes sure they walk right where the first fellow can see them doing it, and, well, they burn the eyes out of his head."
So Eszterhazy, not much the wiser, went back to the account books, which were increasingly taking on aspects of the higher mysteries. And by, from page to page, and from one week's entry to another week's entry, he observed one iterated and reiterated note. "To Charity, 3 eggs. To Charity, 1 pullet. To Charity, loaf of bread and jar of honey." All very traditional. Some of these items, no doubt, came from the home farm, Sir Grax itself. Others must have come from the tributes. Lady Emma could eat only so many eggs, put but so much honey on her bread, and the bread, if baked hereabouts, would be stale by the time it got to Bella. Charity was its logical destination. Loud groans came from the gardener, and audible mumbles about his age and his work burdens, and the ingratitude of boys who went traipsing out on excursions and never made up their proper work afterwards. After a repeated statement by Eszterhazy that he desired a light, very light, and a very much lighter lunch, finally he was allowed to go out botanizing by himself all day long, though Frau Chilperitz clearly was not sure that sheer inanition may not now lay him low, a mere 2 sandwiches and a piece of fruit. The red of the rowan seemed to lead him on a certain way the next day. That rowan tree whose wood was half haunted and half a charm all by itself. But one tree turned out not to be a rowan at all. Another one was indeed a rowan, but so unhealthy, by reason of sour soil, or what have you, that he scorned to stop by it. And at length, when he saw what seemed just what he wanted, he was obliged to go down a steeper slope than he had bargained for. But it was a rowan, all right, and it was a good one.
"Ah, young lord, thee knows the right tree,"
a high, clear voice said, near behind him. He turned to see what boy this was who addressed him in the thou form, and saw no boy at all, but an old woman, a veritable old woman, archetypal hag and crone by her looks, stooped, bent, ragged, filthy, but sound enough in health for all of that.
"And thee knows it too, granny,"
he said, making her a bow.
"Ah, under knows them all, under knows 'em all. And thee be's pleased to come along down to my cot. I'll show thee some nice ones."
An old herb woman, then. Good. He came along willingly. Cot, she called it. It was not so much cottage, it was a hovel of the classical sort, straight out of the grimmer fairy tales. She had a stool in front and gestured him to sit down. Inside the cottage, where she could be seen flitting back and forth, she was speaking, saying what? Talking to herself, no doubt, or to someone inside. Someone? Speaking to a cat or a dog, perhaps.
"Now, here is a stoop of metheglin, young lord, as I made myself out of the best honey and such, and whiles ye drink, Unda will show off her yarbs, for words come her way, as the young lord be's interested in the like."
She had, of course, no notion of preserving her plants. Her interest in them was not his. They were all shrunken dried, or in process of drying, but by no means without interest even so. He sipped the metheglin. He took samples. He made notes. There was a mighty bad smell coming from somewhere nearby, though, and by it grew upon him that there were some mighty odd sounds, too. Old Unda saw that.
"Thee'll be wanting a look, young lord,"
she said simply, laying down a twist of herbery. Getting up, she beckoned him after her to the cottage door. Inside, half the hovel was barricaded from earthen floor to thatched roof, to the beams of the roof, anyway. Something passed back and forth in there, glimpses showing between the palings, stout and thick poles, and oh, the stink! He stepped forward, but not very much so. Back and forth, a man was walking on all fours. Not on hands and knees, not with legs bent. A man was walking back and forth, on the flats of his hands and feet, his rump elevated, but somehow, it was odd, not so much as one would think it would be. A man with clotted hair and filthy rags. A man staring either down or straight ahead, but never up. He stared out, unseeing, as he turned to begin his pacing once again, and Eszterhazy shuddered. The face, oh so briefly turned his way, was as blank as any beast's face in a cage, but it was a man's face, though not much save the physical semblance of a man's face was left to it. The face wrinkled and made a snuffling sound. The face only partly wrinkled, a face horribly scarred, the scar reaching from the tangled scalp down into the tangled beard, obliterating one eye. Softly, softly, old Unda said, not as though speaking to anyone, "Ah, my God, ah, my darling and my beau." The wretched remnant of a man halted uncertainly and growled. Unda, as deftly as one who does an act done often and over, took up a pole and poked it between the palings of the cage. Something came up out of the heap of stinking straw, something all stuck about with straw, something dark. "There it be, my darling," she said. "There, it's all right." The man-thing nuzzled it, toyed about with it, seemed briefly comforted by it. Then once more the ceaseless pace began again. It might, indeed, that which she had fetched up from where he had last forgotten it, it might indeed have been, once and long ago, a shako. One of those hats, uselessly ornamental and made of bearskin, which sat so smartly upon the heads of the hussar troops. And little enough protection had it served him when the Serb shell sprang open into horrid glory so close to his once brave head. "Ah, my God, old Unda breathed, my darling, and my beau." So that night he called Chilperitz up into his room, and he said, "All right, Chilperitz, now let's hear the whole story, if you please." The steward's face was wearing his formal and stiff expression, but beneath it he seemed a bit relaxed, even if not happy. "Your the doctor, has read the account books, then?" he said. The doctor had. "These charities, then, they're all for old Unda, aren't they?" Again the impression of relief. "Yes, sir. Oh, well, not all of them, no. Now and then Father Aleritz, he suggests we do this and that, and of course, Doctor, we do. But as a regular thing, yes, sir. Almost these charities are for old Unda, yes, sir." At once the formal air fell away. "She'd starve, sir, weren't it for the charities of Sgrax? Those bits of pennies the women give her for herbs and charms, how much do they buy?" Eszterhazy said nothing, he only looked on. "And she shouldn't starve. No, not she. Not whilst a loaf of bread is baked at Sgrax, or elsewhere in the Grax, for that." "Chilperitz, there is no desire on my part, and none, I am sure, on Lady Emma's, that old Unda or anyone else should starve. But why, Chilperitz, why all the mystery?" The steward stared. "Can it be, Doctor, that you don't know?" "No more than I know why Philly should be encumbered with a pension for the boy's grandmother up at Wolfenspring." "Ah, there is a connection." Still Chilperitz shook his head, amazed. Then he said, "Oh, yes, sir, a connection indeed. And I see you really do not know. Why, sir, it was his late lordship, don't you see, sir?" Eszterhazy still did not see. That is, he would then and there have said that he did not see. And yet, when next he heard the steward's voice, he realized that the possibility of it had lain in his mind for some time now, unrecognized but seen. "What, Uncle Ferdinando?" "Yes, sir. Ah, speak no word of evil of the dead and all, but, well, Doctor,
In a word or so, his late lordship was a very devil with the women, sir, but those two the most.
That Captain Eszterhazy had his favourites among the girls of the district surprised no one. They would have been surprised if it had not been so. And that there were involved aspects of these expected passions was not in itself unexpected. However, no one can predict the end of an affair in all its details, and the affair or affairs were not done with even yet. Not even yet. The late captain's nephew listened long and with chin in hand, and now and then he asked a question as the twigs snapped in the stove, filling the room with their scent. And now and then he made a statement, and now and then he merely nodded. For the most, he was silent. Elisa Fetter's parents were sub-tenants, of which the Gracks had not many, few of the farms being large enough to allow of it. Somehow, though, the parents, 3 children, she the oldest, and 1 cow, were fitted into the economy of Philly's holding. And for the small plot of rye, and the small plot of wheat, the truck garden, and the grazing right, the firewood, for all these Elisa Fetter's family paid. Paid in cash, paid in tribute, paid in labour. And then, Elisa Fetter growing tall and comely, Philly began to make it plain that he expected another kind of payment too. His suggestions did not include marriage. Her parents, already old in their middle age, suffered the hail and the drought when they came. They could not, after all, resist them, nor could they resist Philly. Still, Elisa Fetter did not yield. The suggestions became threats, and the threats became menaces. And then Captain Eszterhazy, who became Uncle Ferdinando, appeared, back from military service on leave. He saw Elisa Fetter. Elisa Fetter saw him. The old couple who rented Wolfenspring suddenly found themselves en route to join their son on his homestead in the distant America, all expenses paid by Captain Eszterhazy. And, equally suddenly, Philly had no sub-tenant family to menace. Small as Wolfenspring was, it was spacious in comparison. And Elisa Fetter no longer vanished when the caller came. Or, if she did, it was only to vanish with him. However, no one expected the lord of the manor to content himself with 1 woman, nor did he. Kunigunda's father, by old right, cut wood in the hills. His daughter grew up wild, and wild she stayed. Rumour attributed her black hair and black eyes and her wild ways to some long-dead mountain Cigani. Rumour told of the young captain's suit. Rumour called the suit successful. But even rumour conceded that the success was not lasting. Kunigunda was wild, and her affections wandered. That is, they wandered until the day she met the young hussar, in his own turn back on leave. The captain stormed. Kunigunda simply tossed back her wild black hair, laughed, and laughing ran off. Did Captain Eszterhazy pull strings, exert influence? His nephew, now, so long later, preferred to hope not. Perhaps it was only the quickening pace of the Serbian war which caused the hussar's leave to be cancelled. Kunigunda wept, but still she ran off when her former lover appeared. "Then Gabro came back that first time, having run off from the hospital, you see," Chilperitz explained. "She saw at once that he could never be the same, mad, and so awfully wounded as he was. Ah, Sir Doctor, a woman's love is a wondrous thing. She took it on herself to care for him, and finally, as you know, sir, the authorities, they stopped trying to take him back. Of course, they paid him no pension for all his wound, since he was termed a deserter for having run off from the hospital. Under, she never made no never mind of that. When there was no food, she worked for it. When there was no work, she stole it. And she never would take captain's orders to send Gabro Hussar away. So, by and by, he stopped trying. By and by, also, retired from military service, and first, spending most of his time in Bela, and then travelling abroad, married, finally. He had agreed that the affair with Elisaveta was lawfully finished. She married, had a daughter, was widowed when still young, and her days passed in the cycle of work and of Sunday church and the festivals and work again. And so passed the years. Ferdinando Eszterhazy's will was many pages long. One of the clauses included the prescription that all benefices and encumbrances shall continue as recorded, and the notary, in Grach, removing the records from the files, discovered that Elisaveta's years of age were to be assisted by a pension. It not being in the will proper, Lady Emma never learned of it, nor did it come in any way out of her own income. It was to be paid by filii.
You see, then, Doctor, this was his late lordship's way of getting back at filii for having tried to bother Elisaveta. And then, too, filii is rich and can afford it.
Rich in money, yes, but the paying of the pension cost him more than money. Twice a year, year after year, decade after decade, to have his old passions dug from their grave, though perhaps they had never died, in which case how much worse! Never to be able to forget, loss kept forever fresh. No wonder he had stormed, wept. Indeed, in his own brute peasant way, he must have loved Elisaveta too.
Though I do know, the steward said, that he writes to her ladyship in Bela, and he complains.
Ah, indeed. Never would Filii have brought himself to lay his whole case bare and open. Rage would have found vent in mere complaints, perhaps barely coherent, in insinuations and innuendos, and to no aid to his cause. And to what aid, then? Simply to plant in the mind of his landlady a single thought. I am sure the steward cheats me.
To old Under, Eszterhazy mused, my uncle left nothing. That was his punishment for her. He ought to have done better. I believe, though—
He forced back memory, and back she went unwillingly,
that he may have had this on his mind in his last days. I think so.
Chilperitz thought so too,
but he did not get around to do it in writing.
So I has taken it upon myself to do it for him. I believe it is for the good of his soul, and that he rests easier for our doing of it.
By it, meaning the doles and the boons, the trickle of charities which helped keep alive old Under and her old and so terribly afflicted Hussar lover.
Though I do not care to explain it to her ladyship, and I am sure that she thinks the worse of me for all.
Dr. Eszterhazy nodded. A sudden swift yawn, not of boredom but of fatigue, rose from within him. He checked it and started to rise.
A sudden thought. Now, an idea has just come to me, Chilperitz. Do you suppose Filii would exchange? What is the name of the next largest farm here? Gothenford, isn't it? Yes. Surely, whoever has the Gothenford would accept Alarit's stead. And then Filii, well, his income would be less, but he need pay no encumbrance. It would not be forever reminding him.
The steward, with a sigh which was only half reproach, said that he had thought of that long ago, and more than once since then suggested it to Filii.
Sir, I have, you might say, pressed it on him, but he won't do it. He says it would be a come-down for him, and that people would talk. That's what he says, that people would talk."
People came and talked to Eszterhazy as he lay in his bed in the best guest-room at Sagrach. There was his uncle Ferdinando, again young and dashing. There was Elisafetta, grown young for another miracle. Old Unda was young Cunigunda, and beside her was the equally young Gabbro, in his hussar's shako with its death's head emblem. They talked and they talked, but not a word of what they said reached his ears, not even a sound of it. The sound which did reach his ears, rousing him up from slumber and from bed, contained none of these voices. There were screams and shouts and snarls and growls, all from below and to the rear of the house. Eszterhazy leaped from his bed into his trousers, took up a lantern, and made his way through the dark old house. The lantern beam fell first upon Frau Chilperitz, her hair down around her shoulders upon the back steps of the house, and wringing her hands in that age-old symbol of feminine distress.
"What is this, my Frau?" "Ah, sir, it is a bear raiding the smoke-house for the meat. Ah, sir, do take care. Although—"
she screamed into the darkness as Eszterhazy darted off into it.
"Although, take care, the young lord is out here."
Her husband called back something which Eszterhazy did not understand, and then Eszterhazy stumbled and fell. The lantern fell also, and in its beam, wasting itself on the upper boles of a tree before it sank into extinction, Eszterhazy saw the bear. He saw it but for a moment, as it shuffled past him at half a run. It was upright, holding something in its forepaws, a side of smoked pig, probably, and it tore at it, growling as it fled. This was seemingly not its first incursion at some farmstead, for it had been wounded once, long before. There was a huge scar on its head, long-healed, and reaching from scalp to cheek. Whatever had torn into the bear's head, perhaps some farmer's axe, had in so doing torn the very eye from the beast's head. Eszterhazy cried out, and simultaneously a gun went off. A woman screamed,
"Oh, God, Otto, if you've shot the young lord!"
He called out to them, assured them that he had not been shot at all, but demanded that the guns be put up.
"Or someone may be shot, you all stumbling about in the blackness like this,"
he added, feeling decidedly grumpy about the whole thing. His grumpiness seemed to reassure them all. A grumpy gentleman was a figure familiar in type and fact, something with which one could deal.
"'Tis past time we did fix that smoke-house door,"
they agreed apologetically. And in the morning they showed him the bear's prints in the soft earth between the smoke-house and the spring. Old Unda, late that morning, rose and curtsied to him. She blessed him and his gift of money, but did not offer to show him more herbs. Nor did she offer another stoop of metheglin. In fact, she said nothing more at all. And when Eszterhazy went into the cabin, she accompanied him and sighed a sigh which may have meant anything at all. Nothing was moving behind the palings. Something was lying on the sad, stale straw. Eszterhazy felt himself chilled, felt an oppression on his chest. Gabbro Hussar sat crouched in a corner. It would have been the last touch if he had been bleeding from a bullet wound, but there was no sign of blood or wound. The wretched man merely crouched, staring blankly, and fondled the filthy remnant of his once proud hussar's hat.
"Is he all right?"
Eszterhazy finally asked. She did speak now.
"As always,"
she said. With that, the man crouching in the corner eased out on all fours, and began the same mindless pacing back and forth, back and forth, back and forth.
"When it is very hot,"
she said in a tired, subdued voice,
"and he is very tired, he will often let me bathe him."
And that was all she said. All the way back to Sir Grax, Eszterhazy turned the matter over in his mind. Very well. Lycanthropy was a mere legend born of ignorance, descended out of dimly remembered totemism on the one hand, and buttressed by outbursts of simple, animal, imitative insanity on the other. Men did not turn into bears, any more than into wolves, this last being merely the commonest form of the legend and giving it its name. This being the case, one had only to acknowledge the existence of two living and entirely different creatures, though both living in the same area of the province, one a man and one a bear, each of which bore identical scars, and each scar in the same place on their heads, and each of which had lost an eye, and in each case the same eye. That was all one had to accept. It might almost be easier to accept lycanthropy. Of course, one was not absolutely obliged to accept either. One simply acknowledged the phenomena, and one simply said, "No explanation." It was certainly a mistake, too, to think that one had to supply an explanation for everything. It was perhaps a mistake to think that there had to be an explanation for everything. The railroad had not yet reached Grac, and perhaps never would. The new road was well built and smooth enough. The ride in the diligence required no effort. No effort, that is, besides holding on to the leather straps provided at each seat, each time the coach turned a bend. The new road, however, was full of bends. To read a book or paper would not have been impossible, but it would have been inconvenient. The ride to the railhead at Dominet's gave Eszterhazy time to pass in thought as he wished. He did not particularly wish to think about the scene he had left behind him, but think about it he did. What, after all, had he done? He had, after all, done nothing. He had left things just as he found them, just as they had been before he arrived, as they had been all along. And for some reason a few lines came to his mind from A Life of Luther, which he had once read. "One day Dr. Luther said to Dr. Melanchthon, 'Philip, this day thou and I will go fishing, and leave the governance of the universe to God.'" Sometimes the right thing to do was to do nothing. And back in Bella, when Lady Emma asked, "And so now, tell me, doesn't the steward cheat me?" he answered, "Well, just a little bit." And she said contentedly, "I thought so," and at once forgot.